Start recording. Okay, welcome.
Good morning. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
You go first.
Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are, to our fourth seminar, Post-Truth and the Musical Humanities. And let me just briefly remind you, most of you, I think, have been here before. The way in which we have our discussion afterwards is that you are invited to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and to then already while we have the presentation going on, you can type in some questions and we will pick them up later. But also you can, of course, do it after the end of it, and then we will interact that way and answer the questions one after the other. I hand you over to Ali Monchick now, who will introduce our speaker.
Welcome to, again in our fourth seminar. And today I would like to introduce Robert Fink from UCLA. With his talk, The Empirical Strikes Back.
And let me, just because it's causing me anxiety, let me deal with the technology and show you what the empirical strikes back looks like, and then we can begin. Okay, in my mind, people are laughing. I hope that's true. There we go. Okay. So someone will presumably tell me if they can't see the presentation. Some of you may recognize the scene there, and I'm going to keep coming back to this image. And I want to thank you all in advance for listening to what I think is going to be a somewhat dense, but hopefully information-rich talk. And I want to set your expectations right away. I'm not going to have much to say about post-truth, except by implication. It'll be in there, but it's not the main focus. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time attempting to convince you directly that there is some kind of data science-enabled white racial frame around the study of American popular music, although that does show up too in the talk. But I want to be clear, I'm not accusing musicology or empirical music theory as it's currently practiced, or even the mostly white European experts in audio engineering and music information retrieval, whose work I'm going to spend most of my time critiquing today, of conscious racism. I don't believe science is racist. At least, I don't think science done right is racist. Clearly, it's possible for big data to be a conduit to the dark side of the force, which is an inconvenient truth at a moment when listening to the science, and this showed up in the newspaper literally the day I was working on the final draft of this, with its legitimate claims to respect science, data, and the facts, seems like the only way out of the many societal and ecological challenges the world faces today. But if I can argue mimetically for a moment, picture sometimes looks like this to me. And here's my meme. Data scientists in league with the dark forces of technology and capital extend their gloved hand to a battered musicology. Follow me. Together we can bring order to the galaxy. Okay, so the temptation is real, especially as we struggle with the information overload endemic to an era of pervasive streaming and too cheap to meter music. Music journalist Ben Ratliff called his latest book Every Song Ever, and there's your problem. His grab bag of 20 ways to listen in an age of musical plenty is fine for amateurs, but we're supposed to do better, right? We're professionals. Can machine learning and metadata help us? Maybe they will be the ethnography, philology, and music analysis of the future, the indispensable technical foundations of our discipline. Okay, so some postmodern theory may seem the last thing you want to hang on to right now, but there's no escaping its prescience about this historical moment, post-truth or not. In the hands of information merchants like Google and Spotify, knowledge, including knowledge about music, is power. And I'll read the second half of this quote. The relationship of the suppliers and users of knowledge to the knowledge they supply and use is now tending and will increasingly tend to assume the form already taken by the relationship of commodity producers and consumers to the commodities they produce and consume. So the question of data science inevitably brings up the question of commodifying information, and it'll become very central to what I'm going to talk about today. So that was Jean-Francois Lyotard, very famously talking about science and the postmodern condition. He also foresaw that the commodification of knowledge would come wrapped in technology. We can predict, he said, that anything in the constituted body of knowledge that is not translatable in this way will be abandoned, and that the direction of new research will be dictated by the possibility of its eventual results being translatable into computer language. Along with the hegemony of computers comes a certain logic, and therefore a certain set of prescriptions determining which statements are accepted as knowledge statements. Thus, it's not possible to ignore data science as a musicologist, especially if your subject is popular music. The force is all around us. Can we recognize the dark and the light? Okay, that's the intro. Here's the first section. And this is sort of the on topic post-truth part of the talk. I want to revisit a notorious outbreak of musical fake news from 2012. On July 26th, 2012, Scientific Reports, the open access arm of the high impact journal Nature, published a short paper on its website entitled Measuring the Evolution of Western Contemporary Popular Music. Its lead author, Joan Serra, was a young postdoctoral researcher in artificial intelligence who'd worked in the music technology group of the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, Spain. The article, as we'll see, was quite technical, but its conclusions were very strongly stated, so much so that the report had already caught the attention of the global news syndicate Thomson Reuters, which distilled its news value into a fun little 2-minute read, which went out on the wire at 6:04 that morning. Okay, there's a word for this kind of thing: clickbait. The irresistible news hook was the conceit that an age-old battle between kids and their elders about, quote, what's wrong with music today could now be settled algorithmically by crunching through a huge new pile of information called, catchily enough, the million-song dataset. As Reuters summarized it, Serra and his co-authors had proven scientifically that, and I'm quoting now, modern pop music really is louder and does all sound the same. Story went viral immediately. Within hours, dozens of news services and websites around the globe had picked up Serra's research, each providing it with their own particular spin. Left, I love this one actually, or right. Even ironic takes spread the contagion. Soon, the fact that scientists, and I put fact in quotation marks, that scientists had listened to 1 million songs and concluded they were all getting louder and blander was everywhere. It was retailed by a guy trying to sell you songwriting lessons. And it was taken as a spur for a passionate essay on musical literacy by the AAA, by which, of course, I mean the American Accordionists Association. Now, the accordion-related press actually provided its subscribers with quite a sophisticated take, hitting the key ideological and technical issues that I'm going to be covering today. After making sure readers knew the research was done by legitimate scientists at a European Technology Institute, they emphasized the amount of data crunched, the complexity of the algorithms used, and the focus on variety of timbre as a key indicator of musical value. Okay, so now are my second section. Big bad data. Okay, it's not actually entirely fair to call the spate of stories about Serrat's work fake news. He really did say right at the beginning of his paper that all pop music sounds the same. That's literally the first sentence of his paper. And that thanks to recent advances in data science, he now had the unique opportunity to prove it. Current technologies for music information processing provide a unique opportunity to answer the above questions, including isn't it all the same, under objective, empirical, and quantitative premises. So at the end of his short 5-page report, it was only 5 pages, because all the real science or info science was buried in a separate mathematical supplement that no journalists even looked at, I think. Serrat, whose PhD research had been on how machines could learn to read audio data, was ready to make some sweeping statements about how people should listen to popular music. So he points out here what he calls a sense of blockage or no evolution in the creation and production of contemporary Western popular music, claiming that from a global perspective, pop music would have no clear trends and show no considerable changes in more than 50 years. Then there's a lot of technical stuff. And finally, we observe a number of trends in the evolution of contemporary popular music. These point towards less variety in pitch transitions, towards a consistent homogenization of the timbral palette, and towards louder and in the end, potentially poorer volume dynamics. Or to put it another way, pop music too loud and all sounds the same, scientists confer. So either Serrat really did dislike contemporary music, or more likely, he knew what kind of a narrative to spin around the relatively arcane technical challenges in data mining he was exploring. So we could just leave it there, fake news. But I want to dig deeper, because behind all those hokey headlines, something genuinely newsworthy was afoot. I want to talk a little bit now about the million song data set and how it came to be. Serrat and his team were enabled in their research by a public-private data initiative masterminded by the music information and retrieval pioneer, the EchoNest. And this is their blog. And as the EchoNest blog from back then makes clear, this little Boston-based tech startup, founded by 2 graduates of MIT's Music and Media Lab, was consciously working to foster research and development by opening up application programming interfaces, or APIs, to its proprietary collection of musical metadata, which was quickly becoming the largest in the world. And this is on their blog, the announcement of the million song data set. So when it collaborated in early 2011 with speech and audio researchers at Columbia University to release the million song data set, it was part of a concerted corporate strategy to get third-party programmers and independent scientists to work with EchoNest's data structures, to trade open access for free help with a side order of hegemony. So the strategy and its trade-offs should be familiar to anyone who's ever run a Google search, right? You can use our data, we'll give you answers, you give us your data, we become more powerful. So the rise of the EchoNest epitomizes Lyotard's insight that in a postmodern society, suppliers and users of information will inevitably relate to it as a commodity form. That was the EchoNest's entire business model. It was validated for all time when Spotify bought the company and its mountain of musical metadata for something like US $100 million. And this should also clear up a common misconception about the million song data set. I want you to remember this. When they hear about it, most people imagine something like a huge MP3 playlist holding the audio for 1 million songs, right? That's what you would think, 1 million song data set. But in 2011, that much audio data would have been about 10 terabytes, would have been impossible for anyone to work with. And even more crucially, the Echo Nest, which owned no copyrights except in its own metadata, had no right to give away access to the music itself. So this was actually the story behind the clickbait headlines. Investing in the rising value of information about music, a software company, Echo Nest, had collaborated with an Ivy League university to give researchers free access to a data set scaled to the size of the actual commercial market for music, to let them play with the big boys, as it were. Now, it might seem that by using Echo Nest's data set about pop music to trash pop music, Serra was biting the hand that fed him the data. But as Lyotard points out, what is really important about postmodern scientific research is not any socially progressive or conservative result, but that the scientific research validate the capitalist exchange value of data itself. And by that metric, Serra's work was a huge success. He was one of the first researchers to engage deeply with the analytical complexity of Echo Nest's metadata, and suddenly everyone was talking about the 1 million song data set as a synecdoche for actual music. I mean, how much data did Echo Nest have? How cool were they that they could just give away the key to 1 million songs for free? Okay, now this is where things have to start getting more than a little bit technical. So I don't necessarily want to dispute Serra's attacks on popular music itself. After all, that's not what's in the database. Actually, I do, but that's hardly a surprise, is it? Right? I really want to attack what he does with the Echo Nest's data about popular music. So I think that in his hands, it becomes bad data. Or at the very least, it's not, as the British put it, fit for purpose. It's not fit for musicological purpose anyway. And to understand why, I have to take you pretty far down the rabbit hole into that data. So I want to hope you will accept my apologies in advance. This is going to get kind of nerdy. Hopefully, it will be interesting to find out exactly what is in that data set, because it's in some ways the keys to a huge amount of the musical kingdom of 21st century pop music. Okay, so let's return. Okay, right. Okay, so let me return to the metadata discussion that launched 1,000 headlines, right? So this is the end of Sarah's article. To fit it on one slide, and so as not to scare you off right away, I left out most of the technical stuff. It's what's in between those two quotes. So, okay, let's all take a deep breath and I'll put it back in. So here is the scientific version of pop music is too loud, all sounds the same. And I'm not actually going to read this out loud because I don't expect you to understand it yet. We will have, by the end, in the next 10 minutes, you'll have us be able to actually sort of evaluate this. But there are many terms in the paragraph that we could try to define, but let's begin with the basics, right? Which are loudness, pitch, and timbre. So Serra chose these three analytical parameters because, unlike the audio itself, they are in the data set. Echo Nest, which is, and these have been taken over by Spotify. So if you go online, you can actually find this API, this Analyze API. This API allows anyone to access the output of their proprietary audio analysis algorithms, which filter and compress the massive information in an audio signal into 3 smaller arrays of numbers they call vectors. 1 for pitch, 1 for timbre, and 1 for maximum loudness. So let me explain how this works. The pitch, timbre, loudness vectors in the data set are calculated across what Echo Nest called segments. A segment corresponds roughly to a single musical event. Technically, it's a time span where the pitch, timbre, and loudness vectors don't change much. And thus, segments are of arbitrary length and very short, on the order of 100 to 500 milliseconds. So I want to be clear. Most of the data that Serra is relying on to make his arguments is technical data, series of numbers, which describe what's happening in a tiny slice of the music, less than half a second, sometimes more like a tenth of a second. Now, what's elegant about the EchoNest analyzer is that based only on the timbre, pitch, loudness calculations, with no other knowledge of how music works, the algorithm is able to induce the rhythmic structure of the music, forecasting a grid of beats, bars, and even larger sections like verses and choruses from the ground up. So here's a visual representation, which is machine derived directly from the analyzer API of a typical track in the million song data set. So segments are at the very bottom. And if you're wondering what that song is, I've just Rickrolled you. Okay, so that is Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley, which is the one entry in the database which they give you if you went to the old EchoNest website. You could download one data record and it was this song. So yeah, they got a sense of humor at EchoNest. So as I just pointed out, the segments are extremely short. In Never Gonna Give You Up, operative units over which the pitch, timbre, loudness is measured are on average shorter than the fastest rhythmic values EchoNest thinks we can perceive, which they call tatums. This is so nerdy, after the famously fleet-fingered pianist. So they have a level of pulse, which they call a tatum, which is the fastest note you can perceive. Now, this isn't always the case. Take a different track, like Justin Bieber's Stay, which is the #1 song on the pop chart today. It has different length segments based on its shifting patterns of pitch, timbre, and maximum loudness. Okay, so I want to let you look inside the output of the EchoNest Analyzer API. What it returns when you put a song into it is an incredibly long text file. So long that there's no way to view it in PowerPoint. So I've got to stop my presentation and switch over. So hold on. Or actually, I just need to change the focus of my screen share for a second. So you can see me again. I'm still here. And yeah, it's just text. So I have it in a notes file. Right. So here is the data for Justin Bieber's Stay. And it's an incredibly long text file that you basically just parse with a text parser like Python or something. So let me just show you what it looks like. I mean, one of the points just to make is this is what's in the data set, not any kind of music. It's this stuff. So any conclusions about how music works or about how music evolves are based on this data set, which doesn't inherently mean it's a garbage, but well, we're getting there.
I think you're not yet seeing what you want to show.
Oh, is that not there? Okay, let me try again.
We are seeing ourselves.
Well, that's always attractive. Oh, yeah, I guess let's try again. That should work.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for keeping me from rattling on. All right. So now you're looking at this data structure. Hopefully it's alienating enough to make my point. So at the top, you can see this is the function call that you send to the API, specifying a particular track with a huge long string, and you get back this massive text file. And I'm going to slide down past these very opaque variables that are like code strings and things to get to the actual metadata. So here we begin. This is first you get the onset and duration of every bar, which has been calculated by let me make sure I'm saying this right. Yeah, okay. So those are the bars. You scroll down further. You go past the beats and the sections, and you end up, here we go, with the segments. So this is where all the audio analysis data is. So I just wanted you to see. So, and there are hundreds and hundreds of segments for this song, right? The segments are basically, as you can see, the duration of a segment is about, you know, something like 200 milliseconds. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these segments. For each segment, you have a set of data about loudness, something about pitch, something about timbre. So I just wanted you to see that. I'm now going to go back to my PowerPoint and start taking this apart. So let me do the same little do-si-do I just did. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me take you through this as quickly as I can. The first thing you get in a segment is when it starts in time, how long it is, and how sure the algorithm is about that. And right, that's a very, very short slice of music. I just want to reiterate. Then you have 4 measurements of loudness in decibels, how loud the segment starts and ends, and what and where the loudest point is in it. And this data is pretty easy to read musically in this case, right? The loudest point is almost immediately after the onset of the segment, 0.01 seconds, and is significantly louder than the start or the finish. So it's probably a drum hit or something. Now things get more tricky with the next data structure in the segment, which is pitches. You can see those down below. Using fast Fourier transforms, let me go for it. Yeah. Using fast Fourier transforms, the EchoNest analyzer distills this about 400 milliseconds of audio into what they call a chroma vector. That is an array of 12 numbers that represent the 12 equal tempered pitches of Western music. And if you're wondering when the white racial frame was going to make an appearance, there it is, right? So the data set assumes 12-tone equal temperament. Now, each fractional number in that vector, you can see them just cascading down the left-hand side, represents the relative dominance of that set of frequencies in the mix. Note that one of the pitch classes, in this case, the first one in order position 0, which stands for C natural, is represented by the value 1, that is total dominance. And this is an artifact of the algorithm, which normalizes the chroma vector. And I'm listening to myself say this stuff, and I want you to understand this is a conscious rhetorical strategy, just to give you a sense of how abstract this all is. So they normalize the chroma vector by its strongest dimension, so you can tell by the spread of values how noisy the sound is. So let me show you how this works. I have a little diagram. So here are the 12 pitch classes represented in the chroma vector for this tiny little segment of Justin Bieber. I can shade each one in proportion to the values in the vector. And so you can see a fuzzy preponderance of several pitch classes, which might be interpreted as one chord, right? Maybe it's an F minor, or another. So I want to stop for a second. I want you to think about what Yohann Serrat is going to do with this tiny slice of fuzzy data. He's going to make an argument about chordal variety, and by implication, harmonic complexity, and by implication from that, musical value. It's a huge structure to erect on this tiny little data structure. But it gets more complicated and strange. Now, I hope this works. This is a little animation that I spent quite a bit of time doing. Oh yeah, oh yeah, okay. So we come to timbre, a particular interest of mine. And frankly, it's impossible to understand how timbre is calculated in the data set without direct access to the EchoNest algorithms for timbral analysis, which are proprietary. And I went and did some research, and there are many people who complain about this in the literature, that they can only get so far and then they have to take it on faith. All we have is the explanation in the EchoNest documentation of their API, which is to say the least a little bit opaque. And just relax. I don't expect you to read that. I just put it there as a kind of block of scary text. I did highlight the thing that I think is sort of the thing I understand the best, right? The EchoNest analyzer's timbre feature is a vector that includes 12 unbounded values roughly centered around 0. These values are high-level abstractions of the spectral surface ordered by degree of importance. High-level abstractions. So we have to dig into this a little because this kind of timbral parsing is the ground up, it's the data from which all the other outputs of the Analyze API are generated. So in effect, the algorithm abstracts from the ongoing audio signal based on 12 ideal type configurations of what it calls the spectral surface. Why are there 12? I don't know. I'm suspicious about that. These surfaces are in fact complex three-dimensional vector spaces themselves. So this set of numbers in the timbre vector is incredibly complex and abstract. Some of them are supposed to correspond to psychoacoustic sensations we have names for, like loudness, brightness, flatness, strongness of attack. But most of them, and I just love this little thing I highlighted, right? It ends with an etc., right? So we have loudness, brightness, flatness, attack, etc. And the etc. is completely unknowable. They're just pure mathematical abstractions represented by these 12 spectrograms, which are in the EchoNest documentation. What they are, I think, is timbre classes. They're abstract timbre classes, kind of like the more familiar pitch classes that we know from music theory and that show up in the chroma vector. And for each timbre class, the data set gives an unbounded value, a real number that can be either positive or negative. This is a coefficient by which you conceptually multiply the base function that defines that timbre class. Sum them all up, and you have some kind of mathematical representation of the sound of one segment, a tiny slice of an audio track. And if that seems confusing and random, I mean it to, right? That is actually what is in the data set. The question of why anyone would do this is open, right? And I'm going to answer it in a second. But I just want you to understand, if you think about it, it's just simply data you could use to understand music in some kind of critical or musicological way. It defies that. It is not that. And I'll probably say that more formally in my text in a second, but I wanted to point it out here. If you're not used to dealing with this kind of data, that's fine, because many of you musicologists. Okay, the EchoNest folks suggest that this timbre vector means little by itself. I'm sure you're ready to believe it. It's really a boundary defining set of values, which they use along with loudness and chroma to confirm where segments begin and end. And I'm going to come back to this point because it's crucial. But let me just do the comparison for a few segments of stay. So here's how you're supposed to use the timbre vector. You're supposed to do this, right? And compare the values. And I've just taken 5 segments, one after another from stay. And it kind of works on its own terms, right? Producing reasonably clear boundaries so that you can feel confident about parsing the audio signal into segments. So if you look, you can see, except for the loudness values, which is number 1, which are more or less the same, you have shifts. But do we really think that this unbelievably fragmented and abstract set of measurements provides any path to a judgment about musical quality? This is how machines listen, not people. So now I want to talk about where that algorithm came from. For the man who developed the algorithms that underlie the Echo Nest, now the Spotify Analyze API, the idea that machines might listen to music more creatively than humans was utopian. Tristan Jehan, and this is his presentation for this was his doctoral defense PowerPoint, was a student of the electronic composer Todd Mackover at MIT. And his 2005 doctoral thesis was on machine-enabled musical creativity. He aimed by training musically intelligent machines to listen algorithmically to unlock the combinatorial power of technology. His computational model would parse streams of audio data, divide them into psychoacoustically coherent segments, and by modulating and recombining them, generate a practical infinity of new music. Now, it's an admirable vision. It's a completely different view of popular music than Serraz. This is no bleached out desert of musical sameness, but what he calls an unexplored frontier where humans and machines could collaborate in the life cycle of listening, composing, and performing. Now, crucially, Jehan's work had no normative or critical aspect. He specifically did not see the data structures created while teaching machines to be, quote, active musicians as capable of supporting value judgments about their work or anybody else's, right? This is what he says in the highlighted stuff I made red. In fact, he claimed that the ability of his algorithms to, quote, listen without, well, it's not a quote, to listen without bias was what made them interesting and useful. So I sort of arrived at the crux of my argument today, which comes in two parts. Part one, Jehan's data structures, whose focus on extracting significant segments of the audio stream through analysis of loudness, pitch, and timbre is already visible in 2005 and becomes the basis of first the Echo Nest and then the Spotify APIs, is purely instrumental to a specific task. So if it's not totally clear, I'm reading this and realizing I went back to this dissertation because this is where the Echo Nest algorithms come from. And this is why those chroma and timbre vectors are so opaque to us as musicologists. They're not actual analytical tools, at least as we understand them. As this diagram from the Echo Nest 2014 documentation shows, the point for them of developing tools to parse loudness, pitch, and timbre was to use that data to predict beats and bars, to allow the machine to figure out for itself, free from any clock or arbitrary time stamping, how the music was articulated in time. Now, this is why there are no representations of complex rhythmic patterning, syncopation, polyrhythm, or swing in the data set. It's not because Jehan didn't value Afro-diasporic music. His dissertation is filled with stuff like Sex Machine. He was particularly proud of his algorithm's ability to learn where the downbeats fell, even in tricky syncopated Afro-Caribbean repertoires like the maracatu of northeastern Brazil. This was a shock to me. I assumed that the person who came up with these algorithms was some kind of, scientist who only liked classical music. Couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, his algorithm, he said, did better at imposing a regular hierarchical frame of beats and bars on this slippery stuff than most of his colleagues could. So the point for Jehan was not to deliberately impose a white racial frame on music, although that is an undeniable product of the API, picked up and magnified by Sarah's analysis. But here's the key point. If you're using computerized prediction of meter as a way to modularize audio and increase the efficiency of its recombination because you want to make new music, you can't then turn around and ground aesthetic or cultural judgments about music in the repetitive rhythmic structures, the beats and bars, that your software just imposed on it. Okay, and here's part 2 of the crux. What follows from that? In this endeavor, the one that Jehan was doing, the supposed all the sameness of popular music is a feature. It's not a bug. Because most music, and especially popular music, is so repetitious and regular, it's possible to throw away most of the data and still construct a model that preserves the timings you need to slice and dice it. This was actually one of the big things about Jehan's thesis. Analysis and he says, analysis and synthesis of musical audio can share a minimal data representation of the signal acquired through a uniform approach based on perceptual listening and learning. In other words, analysis for him was a process of lossy compression. He was going to throw away most of the data. That was the point. In effect, Jehan optimized his algorithms for one thing: creating a minimal data structure that still allowed machines to predict beats and downbeats, which means they're pretty much useless for anything else. And if you remember nothing else about the talk today, remember this: the EchoNest data structures upon which Joan Serra and his colleagues built that edifice of musical criticism, getting to ultimately say that pop music all sounds the same, are the result of a ruthless process of lossy compression, no different in principle than the psychoacoustically based algorithms that enable MP3 compression. So here's what it boils down to. Imagine using the numerical output of an MP3 encoder as a musicological tool. Is the fact that audio data can be compressed by 90% and still remain recognizable also evidence that modern music sounds the same? You see how far onto the dark side that we've strayed? Okay, I'm going to actually skip over a section where I take Sarah even more to task. So let me just quickly fast forward through a bunch of slides. Everyone wants to know what they were. Okay, and get to the outro. The point of what I just skipped over was that, shockingly, even though the whole point of the algorithms that the EchoNest provides was that they are they compress the audio signal and throw out a huge amount of the data, Serra then goes on and throws out most of what's left, because he wants to compare billions of segments. So he has to throw away most of the data that's in them. So you're left with almost nothing. But let me just get to the end here. So clearly, Joan Serra got and has remained under my skin. Right, I took a first stab at this kind of takedown in 2013, before most of the documentation of the APIs was generally available. So I know a lot more now. Before Spotify bought the EchoNest, before it was clear that Tristan Jehan's audio analysis algorithms would, along with those behind the MP3 and Auto-Tune, shape the landscape of 21st century popular music, for good or ill. My intervention didn't even make a scratch in the discourse. To this very day, if you ask the crowdsourced answer site Quora a tendentious question like, why is today's rock music so dull? It won't be long before someone starts telling you about the million-song dataset. So Lyotard could have saved me the trouble. As he notes, I really don't have standing in this conversation. In the postmodern game of scientific legitimation, and this is him, the performativity of an utterance increases proportionally to the amount of information about its referent one has at one's disposal. He didn't specify, because he didn't need to, that the information doesn't have to be true or relevant. There just needs to be a lot of it. Advantage, Joan Serra. Okay, so let me return one last time to the meme. At the end of their article in Scientific Reports, Serra and his colleagues lay out a research agenda that sounds suspiciously like what a critical musicology or ethnomusicology would resemble if they gave themselves wholly over to the power of data science. Here's the key line. We encourage the development of further historical databases to be able to quantify the major transitions in music history and to start looking at more subtle evolving characteristics of particular genres or artists without forgetting the whole wealth of cultures and music styles present in the world. We could bring order to the entire musical galaxy. Or not. On the whole, I think I'd rather take my chance with the Rebel Alliance. And I'll fade out on that meme. Hopefully you all know the movie well enough to get the reference. If not, that can be the first question you ask. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Bob, for such an interesting, data-driven talk. Really enjoyed it. Haven't heard anything like it, I got to admit. I want to open the floor to questions right now. I remind you to ask in the Q&A rather than the chat if possible. It's at the bottom right next to the raise hand feature. Okay, great. We have one that just popped up, so I'm going to read it so it's in the recording. Thanks a lot for such a fascinating talk. I have a few questions, comments. The first one, yes, maybe making a statement about high dimensional attributes like timbre are dangerous in that it's too complex to simply crunch them into several numerical values. However, low-level features like loudness and loudness dynamics are robustly estimated, and it's a well-established trend among pop producers that making it louder has a higher chance of grabbing listeners' attention, which become possible with the invention of multi-compression. 2, MIR is a rapidly evolving field, and you seem to focus on rather, sorry, I'm going between my glasses and the questions. MIR is a rapidly evolving field, and you seem to focus rather on a paper that came out almost a decade ago. Why only discuss EchoNest that keeps the algorithms as a company's secret? Why not critique the open source libraries like Essentia that you can dig into the nitty-gritty at the code level? And 3, personally, I see a bigger problem with the million song data set in that it mainly consists of Western songs sung in English, making it difficult to generalize anything beyond the Western.
Wow, those are all really excellent and very productive kind of questions. And, you know, in a sense, I have to say, those are all valid points, and let me just sort of respond to them. It is true that, and I had this in the presentation and then took it out. It's true that the specific loudness is probably the least problematic set of mathematical manipulations that happen. And I don't think anyone is denying the sort of loudness wars. So that, yes, because Seurat pretty much leaves the loudness values in the data set alone, and he's able to show that there is a small but actually significant trend towards music's average volume, average dynamic getting louder. And so the pop music too loud is probably not as fake as all sounds the same. I would just say this about that whole loudness war thing. On the one hand, I understand, I mean, it is, yeah, I think it's generally accepted that this is a change in the style of production. The question of whether it is actually, you know, what's it a response to, and is it bad, is different to me. I mean, it seems to me that people haven't really thought through the implications of the change in the way people listen to music. You know, that the rise of mobile listening devices, the rise of MP3 compression, computer speakers, or people literally. I mean, as a musicologist, as a music kind of head, it always blows my mind when people put the phone up to their ear and just listen to music off the phone, from the little tiny speakers. If that is the listening environment, then naturally music is going to adapt. But yes, fair enough. It's not like if that was the only thing that Sarah had said, then it would have been an interesting, but not perhaps as big a deal article. And there had been, within less than 6 months, somebody had gone through the million song data set and simply noted that music had gotten louder. That didn't seem to make a big splash. It was this larger indictment. So the second one, you dismissed let me go back. I can see it here. Okay, point 2, hoist on my own postmodern leotard petard, right? That is a classic moment where effectively the performativity of my utterance is undermined by the fact that I don't actually have as much data as I should, right? So the thing is, I'm attempting to play the game of data science by going into and trying to explain in a humanistic context the assumptions and if you will, the genealogy and the cultural background of a particular data set. Of course, there are lots of other data sets, probably they are better. And I will just admit, yeah, that is further work that I need to do. So I wouldn't want to say that this is an argument that it is impossible by definition to do anything with data science that would actually prove useful for musicology. What I will say is that a lot of the people who are heavily committed to assembling these data sets and to creating this metadata have other interests than musicological analysis. Right? They're interested in things like music information retrieval, selling music, or digital signal processing. I mean, the Columbia University lab that partnered with EchoNest to release the data set is the speech and audio. It was a lot of the algorithms that show up in here are actually involved in people trying to make hearing aids or deal with hearing loss and things. So yes, I'd have to go look. I'm going to go look at those, and I really appreciate actually just a quick pointer as to where the state of the field is. One thing I will say is that people are still, that article has not gone away. And I had a different ending to this talk, which I cut out, where, and stay tuned for the sequel. There are instances where contemporary composers, for instance, are basing their pieces of music on that article, using it to create critiques of popular music. And so it may be that the field has moved on, but that particular moment has not disappeared in the popular discourse. And the third one, I totally agree. I think all I have to say about that is just that there's an entire other side of this question. There were 2 MIT grads who formed the EchoNest. One of them was Jehan, who was mostly involved in the audio processing algorithms, but his colleague Whitman was largely about text parsing. So he was the one who sort of was trying to figure out, could you correlate the stuff that they were able to do using these parsing algorithms with the information from the real world about music that you could get from scraping the web and looking at things like lyrics. So in principle, it's not impossible to imagine a more culturally aware data set than the million song data set. And I guess that's a classic example of a European white racial frame, right? That on the one hand, I'm sure the reason the EchoNest had, the reason that the million song data set has only Western songs sung in English has to do with exactly this problem of being fit for purpose. EchoNest was collecting that metadata because that's where the business case was. That's what was useful, right? So this is when Leotard says that you start relating to information as a commodity, and you treat information as a commodity form. In this case, it's very clear that this information is useful and valuable because it connects up with another commodity form, which is popular music. And so, it's not accidental that all those songs are Western songs sung in English. Okay, so that's my attempt to just very impressionistically deal with really interesting stuff, and hopefully I'd like to get maybe after the seminar, we can try to exchange emails through Ali or Wolfgang. So
Yes, there's another question here. Thanking you again for an interesting talk. And in your opinion, is there any place for data science in musicology? And if so, to what level is it helpful?
I think yes, and this follows on the previous question, and of course, Harin Lee makes the point, which I would agree with. The point is not that it is impossible to imagine machine learning and data science being useful for musicology, but you can't just pick up your data wherever you find it, right? And you can't just, I have a larger kind of critique bubbling in my mind where, for instance, I looked at a bunch of work in music perception and found the opposite problem, that like scientists who work on music perception and who are doing all kinds of complicated experiments where they're putting people in MRI machines or doing all kinds of elaborate double-blind studies, when they come to choose the stimulus that they want to present to their subjects, oftentimes they're incredibly opportunistic and naive about it. Like they literally like, well, maybe I'll just take Call of the Mountain King because I like that or something, so that there's a sense that if data science is going to be useful for musicology, then the data sets have to be, if not created by musicologists, at least created with the input of musicologists, or musicologists at least have to be epistemologically savvy and maybe humble enough to understand what can and can't be inferred or induced or proven by those data sets. So that's another reason why probably I didn't immediately go look for the best data set possible, because I wanted to actually focus on a particularly egregious case where it's clear that this data set was not constructed to make any kind of critical judgments about music. In fact, the guy who first came up with the algorithm specifically, said that that was not his aim. So I do think, I have to say, you saw me at the beginning make reference to the sort of musical abundance problem, right? I do think I am not completely out of sympathy with the sort of distant reading idea in literature. The notion that the opposite of close reading is distant reading, and the idea that, in literature, the same things are happening around, Google's collection of its corpus of the English language, where you can basically run statistical searches on, in fact, all the literature that Google has in its databases. And there is a power to that. I'll give you a specific example and then step back. In some of the other stuff I'm doing, I'm interested in electronic dance music, and in particular, playlist culture and DJ sets. And there is a kind of, when you're dealing with a musical form that is at the same time ubiquitous, so there's huge numbers of these DJ sets, you can get almost a practical infinity of them, quite long and extended. Like, so the DJ sets, last at least an hour, oftentimes way more, and very ephemeral. So it seems almost impossible to like canonize a particular DJ set, right? It's like, so how are you going to actually deal with that? Say anything interesting about like what people are doing in DJ sets. And I have to say, two paths opened up in front of me, and they're sort of the choice I was playing around with you guys today. On the one hand, I have sort of thought, well, maybe I should just make a canon. Maybe I should find the 5 best DJ sets in the world or something. And then I could go intensively into those like a musicologist. But part of me feels like, okay, that doesn't do justice to the reality of how those things actually work. Would it be possible to find some way to have machines parse these data sets and to be able to start talking statistically about how DJs work as a whole? I felt the temptation of the dark side. I've actually felt like you might be able to do something amazing if you could have machines listen for you. But if I'm going to do that, I'm not going to, we're going to have to take charge of the algorithms ourselves, right? I may be like, what is it, Moses? I mean, I may never make it to the promised land. I don't know that I have enough training and enough intelligence and enough mathematical aptitude to do it. Maybe some of our students will, or perhaps this is true interdisciplinary work that could happen. One of the obvious things to ask is, why didn't somebody in that music technology group or that artificial intelligence group in Spain talk to a musicologist at all? Like, wouldn't it have been better to just say, hey, what do you think of this? So perhaps just simple interdisciplinarity. So I will say, I do think there's a place for data science and musicology, but not the relationship of Darth Vader to Luke Skywalker, please.
Bob, I have a question that's actually a follow-up, and you started answering it before I asked it. And it brings a couple themes together from the talk. And people have been dancing around this about basically what makes popular music in this era of hybridity. And we talk about this we can see this in hip hop. We can see this if anyone gets the reference of my background, my favorite genre, which is techno. But of course, there are all sorts of different kinds of EDM now, house, deep house. And I've read that EDM actually has some of the most subcategories ever. So my first question is how do we define pop music? And then my follow-up is, are some of the definitions, to go back to your title, by which we define it, are both racially and LGBTQIA driven? Are we not as interested in doing research on techno because of its gay history? Or are we not so interested in doing hip hop because of its Black history? Do you find that this plays into the frame of what these researchers are calling popular music, even though what actually is popular music in society doesn't necessarily correspond?
Yeah, well, let me riff on that, which is a really interesting. It sort of gets at ideas that were implicit underneath the paper, right? I'll tell you, when I first thought about this, when I first had the sort of irritable reflex that caused me to write a blog post for Musicology Now and the AMS website, I assumed that the people behind the Million Song data set had a kind of typical white baby boomer attitude towards pop music. I just assumed that was part of the problem, because even though Joan Serra is not an American baby boomer, anything but, he seemed to reproduce the classic kind of rockist idea. Music was one of the slides you saw was like, music was better in the 60s, man. So that was one of my favorite things, where somebody did a Tumblr post where they reproduced a completely decontextualized graph from the article, which showed there were more red diamonds in the 60s. We don't know what the red diamonds mean. And they're like, yeah, music, they were sort of making fun of the idea, this is what boomers think. It turns out that the roots of the algorithms were not in that Tristan Jehan actually is a very, he made careful note to use some world music in there to train it, to show his algorithms working on. He actually used almost all funk, soul, and jazz. It was mostly Afro-diasporic music that he used in his dissertation. So if he had a pretty broad and what you might call Catholic sense of the kind of music that he thought his algorithms could usefully work on, it wouldn't correspond with your stereotypical notion of what pop music is. And I also want to point out, just if you want to play around with this, anybody still in the audience, 29 people are still here. Yeah, go on. You can go to the Spotify API webpage, and I'll tell you how to do it. It's really easy. Basically, you open up your own Spotify if you use it. If you don't, forget it. You're out of luck. You have to join the empire. But you can pull up any song from your Spotify on Spotify. What you basically do then is tell Spotify, I want I want to copy a link to that track to my clipboard, you then paste that link somewhere where you can look at it, and you can pull out the track identifier, then you can stick it in the API. You can get, you can do this to any music. And in the early, I was fooling around with it and there wasn't time to do it, but I ran Ligeti's atmospheres through the API. I ran African drumming through the API. I ran the Beach Boys through the API. And, you know, on one hand, it would have been easy to say it all kind of looks the same, right? At this level of granularity. But the point is that all that stuff is in Spotify now. So in principle, it's possible to use the Spotify APIs to look at any music that Spotify has. And even in the million song data set, because of the way they did it, there's all kinds of stuff. There's harpsichord music in there, right? There's Bach, there's early music. I don't know, there's another point where, although the vast majority of what's in the million song data set is sort of rock music, there's other stuff in there. So this is all preliminary to actually dealing with the larger question. And I guess I am with Tristan Jahan. I came to really like, when I read his dissertation, I kind of admired him. I was prepared for him to be the villain in this story, the guy who created the algorithms that enslave us. But in fact, he had a pretty utopian vision where he wasn't very much interested in pop music as a concept, right? He was interested in new music as a concept. New music, which included both the kind of stuff that Todd Mackover was doing, right? Avant-garde electronic music, but also new music of all types, including popular music, world music, any kind of music. And his dream, I sort of, maybe I presented a lot of material, so let me highlight this. His dream was sort of like, I don't know if you remember Jacques Attali's Noise, right? That his dream was something like what Attali was hoping would happen after the what is it, after the era of repetition, the culture of you have the era of composing, where people take control over recorded music again and they begin to create new music. And this is exactly what Jahan wanted to do. He figured these algorithmic tools would allow you to create software where machines could listen to all the music and then they could make new versions of it, and you could customize how they did that so you could get what you wanted. So I think what's tragic in a way is that there is a utopian side to this Echo's Nest algorithm set where it was going to destabilize the very notion of the work and of genre and of what popular music stands for, which is passive consumption of pre-created recorded music. But instead, in the hands of Joan Serra, it just ends up reflecting back to us the image of this very sterile notion of what popular music can be. So does that, I mean, that's what your question made me think of. I don't know if that's even an answer to it, but let me see if I can talk about EDM because I really want to. I guess EDM, if you're interested in dance music, techno and things like that, it does tend, I think the vision of the world of popular music that you get looking from that vantage point looks reasonably close to what Jahan was imagining, right? It's a space where the work is de-emphasized, where infinite recombination of recorded music is sort of the basic game. In its purest form, it really privileges live performance and kind of openness. I don't want to be I don't want to be naive, right? As EDM, as dance music became has become a bigger and bigger thing, it's in a sense regressed to the mean of traditional pop music. So now we have stars and we have songs and we have celebrities, and also DJ sets sometimes solidify into something like an album, which is something like a symphony. But yeah, I do think that it's depressing to see that that the 2005, you're still in a kind of utopian moment of technology, right? If you think yourself back to 2005, we were all very excited to have our iPhones and iPods, right? Apple was awesome. Facebook, I think Ali was on it, but nobody else was on it in 2005, right? It was just for certain college students. And I think there was still a lot of feeling that algorithms and technology could create a utopian world. And that may be another reason why I go back to this 2005, 2011 moment, because it's sort of, it represents a lost moment where things could have been another way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just a couple of comments on the Sarah paper. I think the Sarah paper highlights, I think what the Sarah paper highlights is the very poor review process we find in many general science journals when considering papers related to music and the arts. No journal would allow a paper on chemistry to say something like, the chemical will solve our problems with environmental oil spills. A published scientific article is not allowed to say anything beyond what the data show. The implications are largely left to the readers. But the same journal might accept a paper that says, our chemical analysis leaves no doubt that the painting is by Moreau, as though a single approach can bring closure on some issue. When it comes to music, these science journals view these papers as fun fluff, and so they don't apply the same reviewing criteria. Sarah should have simply concluded that the variance in the data decreases over time, not that the music is simplistic or repetitive. If I had been a reviewer, I would have rejected the paper for making claims well beyond the data, and I suspect that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and then I'm looking at the Q&A and David, hey, I'm really I'm glad that you spoke up, because I'm glad to know that you're here. That Sarah was, I mean, I showed you his picture and I should have made the point. Yeah, he was very young at the time this came out. That picture that I showed you is him now on LinkedIn. So he was just a very much starting whatever career he has. He now works for Dolby Labs. So he hasn't gone on to become, he hasn't tried to become a commentator on popular music. He's just continued his technological, career. So I don't know. It would be probably pretty easy for me, and I think I wouldn't like put this out in print or something without maybe trying to talk to him and say, like, what do you think now? Yeah, I could not agree more. David's right. I mean, I think part of the point of doing all of that kind of nerdy stuff was to effectively to do the review of the paper that didn't happen, and to sort of argue in detail and along the way that the data didn't support the conclusion. Now, of course, for a research scientist, you could just say that, like, yeah, okay, that's clearly the data doesn't support that. But trying to understand in detail why that is so is useful, I think, for us in the humanistic world. It's obvious to David Huron because this is the world he is in. And it wasn't obvious to me until I worked it out. And I think part of the point of this, me doing this talk or, working this out this way is performative in the way that Leotard was talking. Like in this context, to an audience, in the world of musicology, it's probably necessary to go through it in detail and try to explain, because I think if you're not someone who has their main focus in empirical research, it's difficult. You may feel like, well, that can't be right, but why? So yeah, I mean, I do think it's a bad paper. The fact that obviously there's another story, which frankly, I didn't really feel it necessary to tell, which is, yeah, how did this very bad piece of research become clickbait, and then everybody just assumed it was true? And that's probably the racism and the white racial frame part, right? That the reason things become viral like that is they are pseudoscientific, or it's scientists confirm what you already thought, right? And probably, I can't know. I don't know whether Johan Sarah regrets that. One of the arguments I was making is that the Echo Nest was very happy about this, right? I think they were happy to publicize any results that came off of that data because it was part of their strategy. It increased the value of their data. And if more and more researchers started working with their data, they would get more information. Just to say this, I mean, not to sound paranoid, but yeah, you can upload your own track to the Spotify API. You don't have to use one of Spotify's. You can just upload your own audio and they'll do the analysis for you. But of course, then they know about it, right? So there's a way in which, just as you can ask Google to search anything for you, but it knows that you searched that. Yeah, there's interesting things to say about what happened to this sort of little, not particularly good paper after it just got out there. Why did it go viral? How did it work into the larger strategy of EchoNest kind of becoming the dominant figure in musical metadata? So, but yeah, I guess, yeah, that's all I have to say.
And that relates back to our whole theme of post-truth era too, is like, as James Ball and Dancona say, it's when you have this one data point that's close to being credible and it takes off, it spurs all these other narratives. So,
well, this is,
we have one.
Yeah. Kristen, okay, I can read this. Why not?
Yeah.
She's, there's a question. I'm struck by the role of the pop science media in spreading these kinds of quote unquote science proves X thing about music art history headlines and explanations. Do you have any thoughts about the public appeal for easy, seemingly data-driven explanations for the arts and humanities, and what we as musicologists might be able to do to share our expertise more publicly without, as you say, joining the empire? And I think that's the crux of it, and probably why I took, why I dragged you through all that data science in a seminar that's supposed to be about post-truth, because that is actually a crucial question. How do you fight Darth Vader, right? I mean, now, one of the reasons, let me step back and try to take a run at this. I mean, one of the reasons to bring Lyotard in is that people oftentimes connect post-truth with postmodernism, and sort of argue that one of the reasons we have post-truth is because postmodernism. I tend to think I tend to think the opposite way. In other words, what's interesting about Lyotard is that this is one, I'm quoting from one of the foundational texts of postmodern theory, which was effectively a discussion of how scientific research was legitimated and the future of science. So Lyotard sort of is pointing out all these things that are relevant to our discussion, that basically the way to legitimate a claim in the sort of postmodern world is to have a lot of seemingly scientific, well, that's seemingly is a bad word, is to have more data. And the best way to have more data and to store it and retrieve it is to use computers. So the idea that data science becomes the sort of way that, it's the appeal that might in an earlier episteme have been made to biology, right? Or phrenology, at some point, right? So you're starting with Cesare Lombroso. Look, the brow is low. That's why this person is in, that's science. Or the bumps on the skull. And then eventually, the biology, social Darwinism, all of that stuff, the ways that science is called to legitimate, kind of popular prejudice change, but the mechanism stays the same. I think how can we react to this, right? I might throw that out to the other people who are visible, just because I don't know that I have a definitive answer. Let me take a stab at it. One argument is sort of come up in this discussion, which is that you cannot possibly, let me say there's two strategies, I guess. One would be to counterpose to these, I'll hide behind David Huron, this bad science or pseudoscience, or these conclusions unsupported by data. What Lyotard would say is what counterposed against those is narrative, little narratives, basically narratives which explicitly take responsibility for the, value system that they support, or they're critical in a self-reflexive way, right? So the way to sort of fight the data force is to insist on other narratives, or to present narratives, and not to try the other possibility. And that was sort of what I was exploring in the talk a little bit, was to attempt to get that shot into the Death Star. In other words, to go into the data and show how it doesn't work. The problem is, I think in practically speaking, no one's going to pay attention. I don't know that, I guess I'm a little bit pessimistic about this, that I think your two choices are to stand somewhere else waving a big musicology flag and see if anyone pays attention, right? Or I think you just have to, one has to work slowly and systematically to attempt to infuse musicological values into the science, right? Which is hard. It's a task you can imagine trying to do at a modern university. If you think about, this is for those who are, waged, who have jobs at universities, think of the departments that you interact with a lot. It's logical for a musicologist maybe to interact with the German department, or comparative literature, or history, maybe theater studies, depending. But probably you don't hang around a lot with the computer science department, electrical engineering, people who do data structures and the like. And you cannot open a newspaper or a website without finding, while I was working on this talk, I open up an aggregator site and find a story about how some scientists have decided to try to listen to proteins, listen to like various types of proteins, by mapping the protein bonds, like the structure of the protein molecules, onto music. And they say they basically they used Chopin as a model. And so, because it would make it easier to understand. Trust me, if you listen to the stuff they came up with, it sounds nothing like Chopin. It's crazy, right? So that there's the moment where, like, did you play that stuff for anybody who's a musicologist before you put it out there as like proteins plus Chopin? So there's a moment where I guess we have to try to forge networks within the academy to attempt to I guess I'm trying to figure out a metaphor. It's not going to work. I'm trying to get back to the Star Wars metaphor, but forget it. Basically, to try to, since you cannot beat this data, you have to join it.
And we have to wrap up, but just in conclusion, there needs, and I think you're saying the same thing, more cross-pollination in the humanities, and that starts at the undergraduate level too with our curricula. And so,
yeah,
Bob, thank you so much. Yeah.
Let me just thank you guys
Sure.
for this opportunity, and thank everybody who's on the call for following me through these obsessions. If anyone wants to follow up, my APIs are available on the web. You can just send me an email and ask me a question, and I will spit out some data. So I would love to correspond further about this. This is new work. I haven't presented it anywhere before, so please accept it as kind of my attempts to think some stuff through. And I want to thank you, Ali and Wolfgang, for doing this. It's actually some of the most consequential kind of musicology that I participated in a while. So,
that's a compliment. Thank you. Okay, so next week we have our last seminar. I will be speaking post-truth and performance narratives, knowing what you mean and no clue whence that knowledge comes. Of course, a play on the Taruscan quote. So I hope many of you will register. We'll see you for one more seminar, and thank you again for attending.